Some men measure their worth by what they build. Other men measure it by what they can talk you into giving them, and mistake your silence for stupidity. My name is Walter Higbee. I'm 68 years old, a retired structural engineer, and I live outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a house I built with my own two hands after my wife Doreen and I sold everything we had in Ohio and started over. For 19 years, I watched a man named Roland Pierce sit at the head of his table and treat me like hired help, while I quietly kept his daughter's family from falling apart. I never raised my voice, not once. Until the morning, my daughter sent me a text message I read 4 times before I understood what it actually said. It was a Tuesday in early June, the kind of morning the Blue Ridge does better than anywhere on earth. Fog still sitting low in the hollow behind my property, coffee going lukewarm on the porch rail, my old dog Baxter stretched out in a patch of sun like he owned the deed to it. I was out in my workshop, the one I'd built myself, sanding down a cedar hope chest I'd been making for my granddaughter, Casey's graduation, when my phone buzzed against the workbench. I figured it was my daughter Melissa, confirming what time to pick me up for the ceremony that Saturday. I wiped the sawdust off my hands and picked it up. It wasn't a confirmation. It was a door closing. Dad, please don't come to the reception after the ceremony. Grant's parents feel it should just be immediate family on their side. I hope you understand. Love you. I read it once. Then again, slower. Like maybe I'd missed a word that would make it mean something different. Then a third time, just to be sure my own daughter had really typed those sentences and hit send. My only child, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike on a gravel road in Zanesville, telling me to stay home while my granddaughter walked across a stage I'd already bought a ticket to sit in front of. I set the phone face down on the workbench, picked the sandpaper back up, and kept working. Not because it didn't land. Lord, it landed. It landed the way betrayal always does, when it's wrapped in soft words, gentle on the surface and serrated underneath, the kind of cut you don't feel until you see the blood. But I'd had 19 years of practice swallowing things like that whole. I wasn't going to come apart over one text message. Not yet. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to my porch. I tell stories about family, about the kind of quiet a man carries when he's been underestimated for a long time, and about what happens when that quiet finally has somewhere to go. Grab a coffee, settle in, and if you know exactly what kind of in-law I'm about to describe, go ahead and tell me where you're listening from down in the comments, because trust me, you are not alone. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full shape of it before you decide what to think of anyone in this story, including me. 19 years ago, Melissa was 23, a junior at Ohio State, when she called me crying so hard I could barely make out the words. Dad, I'm pregnant. Grant and I are getting married. I told her I was proud of her, that we'd figure it out together, and I meant every word of it. What I didn't know that night was that 3 hours south, in a brick colonial, in a Columbus suburb called Bexley, with a circular driveway and a landscaping contract that ran year-round, Roland Pierce was hearing the same news and arriving at an entirely different conclusion. Grant told me years later that his father's first response wasn't congratulations. It was, well, there goes his future, delivered flat, like a man reading a verdict off a card. Not will help, not welcome to the family, just a quiet, devastating sentence handed down like Grant had failed a test nobody warned him he was taking. From that day on, Roland treated my son-in-law like a man permanently on probation. Every holiday dinner at that house in Bexley felt like a performance review Grant could never pass. Roland would sit at the head of his big glass-top table, the one I later learned was still being paid off 11 years after they bought it, and hold court like he was chairman of some board nobody elected him to. Grant, Melissa's old sorority sister, just made junior partner. 31 years old. Can you imagine? Or my personal favorite, aimed at me, not at Grant, delivered with a smile, always with a smile. An engineer. Huh. Well, at least you understand load-bearing walls. Somebody's got to. His wife Carol was softer about the cruelty, which somehow made it worse. She'd tilt her head and say things like, "We just want Melissa to have the life she was raised for," as if Grant, and by extension me, stood between my daughter and everything she was owed. I used to drive home from those dinners on I-70 with the windows cracked, and I'd talk out loud to Doreen in the passenger seat even after she was gone, because some habits don't know how to quit. Doreen, I swear that man irons his arrogance right along with his shirts. I could almost hear her laugh at that. But here's the part nobody outside my own head understood. Why I kept showing up and swallowing every backhanded comment rolling through across that table. It wasn't weakness. It was arithmetic. Grant had already lost enough dignity in that marriage, not because of Melissa, who loved him plainly and without condition, but because of what her parents made him feel like every single time he sat in their dining room. The last thing I was going to do was force my daughter to stand between her husband and her father and pick a side. That would have broken something in all three of us that wouldn't have gone back together. So I stayed quiet. I smiled. I passed the rolls. And I kept building. 4 years ago, Grant and Melissa bought a house outside Asheville, not far from me, a stone and cedar place on Laurel Ridge Road with good bones and a bad roof. They stretched every dollar they had between them to close on it. When the place started showing its age, foundation settling, knob and tube wiring that hadn't been touched since Eisenhower, a roof that leaked into the nursery they'd just finished painting, Grant mentioned it to me one Sunday afternoon while we were both standing in my workshop, not asking, just talking, the way men do when they're too proud to ask directly and too tired to hide that they need to. I didn't make a speech about it. I called my attorney Monday morning and started moving money. $88,000 over 16 months. New roof, rewired panel, foundation stabilization. A reading nook built into Casey's room exactly the way she'd described it to me over milkshakes at the diner on Tunnel Road. And a mudroom for Melissa because I'd heard her mention wanting one twice, and I wanted her to feel like that house was finally fully hers. I drove out there 3-4 times a week to check the work myself, called in favors from men I'd worked alongside for 30 years to make sure every inch of it was done right. And here's the piece I never told Grant, the real reason underneath all of it. I had watched my son-in-law shrink a little more every time he sat across from Roland Pierce and came up short in his own mind. And I was not going to let him go begging Roland for a dollar he didn't have to beg for. As long as I had money and 2 working hands, my daughter's husband was never going to owe that man a single favor. That was my line, and I never crossed it. The final payment, $11,000, was scheduled to release that Friday, one day after Casey's graduation reception. The reception I'd just been told to skip. I stood in my workshop, a long time that night, hand resting flat on the cedar chest, phone face down on the bench, 68 years old. Buried my wife 6 years back. Built things with these hands my whole life. And my own daughter couldn't hold a seat for me at a table I'd helped pay for. I picked the phone back up, opened her message, and typed 6 words. Understood. Enjoy the day, sweetheart. I hit send. Then I called my attorney, a careful, thorough man out of Asheville named Frank Delacroix, who'd handled my affairs since before Doreen passed. Frank, that final construction payment on Laurel Ridge. Freeze it first thing tomorrow. There was a pause on the line. Everything all right, Walter? Not yet, I told him. But it will be. I hung up, walked back to the workbench, picked the sandpaper back up, and for the first time in 19 years, I stopped building things for people who couldn't be bothered to save me a chair. By 10 the next morning, the crew doing the final foundation punch list work had packed their trucks and left the Laurel Ridge property. The new mudroom sat with exposed subfloor and no cabinetry. A pallet of tile for the reading nook sat under a tarp in the driveway, half installed. The call that told me everything I needed to know about my son-in-law's father-in-law came in at 7:20 the next morning, and Roland himself hadn't dialed it. Melissa had. She didn't say hello. Dad, what did you do? Her voice was already sharp, already accusing, before I'd had my first sip of coffee. Good morning to you too, I said, leaning against my kitchen counter. I take it the crew didn't show. They said the payment stopped. They said you froze it. Her voice cracked somewhere between fury and panic. Dad, we have 40 people coming to this house in 9 days. Grant's parents' whole church group, the Hendersons, from the club. I know exactly who's coming, I said, slow and even. I helped pick the caterer, remember? Then unfreeze it. I think there's a misunderstanding about my situation here, I said, keeping my voice level, almost gentle. I was told I'm not welcome at the celebration, so it stands to reason my checkbook isn't either. There was silence on the other end, the kind where you can practically hear somebody recalculating an entire plan they thought was finished. I hung up before she found words. First time in 19 years I'd ever hung up on my own daughter. I felt worse and better than I expected, both at once, in a way I didn't have a name for yet. If you think freezing that payment was the worst thing I did that week, stay with me. Because what happened over the following 2 weeks didn't just rattle that family. It took the floor out from under all of them. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a decision you can't walk back. Not peaceful, not empty, just final, like the last screw driven into a joint that isn't coming apart again. That's what my house felt like the morning after Casey's reception, the one I hadn't attended. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table Doreen and I had eaten 1,000 breakfasts at, watched the fog burn off the ridge, and I waited, because I knew Melissa would come. I just didn't know how long her pride would hold out against the panic underneath it. It took 40 hours. Thursday evening, I heard the knock. Not the doorbell. The knock. Hard, fast. The knock of somebody who'd rehearsed the whole speech on the drive over and needed to say it before they lost their nerve. I opened the door. Melissa stood on my porch in her work clothes, jaw tight, eyes rimmed red. Behind her, her car was still running in the driveway. She hadn't planned on staying. Dad. She said it like the word cost her something. What is going on? Grant's getting calls from the crew saying the job's dead. The mudroom looks like a construction site. What are you doing? I stepped back from the door. Come in, Melissa. I don't need to come in. I need to know what Melissa. I said it quieter that time. Come inside. She came in. I poured her coffee without asking if she wanted it. Set it down across from me at the table, sat with both hands wrapped around my own mug, and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. She looked tired. Not today tired. Years tired. You sent me a text, I said. Tuesday morning. She shifted in the chair. Dad, that was. Grant's mom was stressed about the seating and Roland was. You sent me a text, I said again, calm, even. Telling me I wasn't welcome at my own granddaughter's graduation reception. Yes or no? Silence. Yes, she said finally, barely above a whisper. Okay, I said, and nodded. Then I think you understand why I made the call I made. No, Dad, I really don't. That's $11,000 sitting between us and a finished house, and you're making a point. I'm not making a point, Melissa. I leaned forward slightly. I'm drawing a line. There's a difference. A point is something you argue. A line is something you finally respect yourself enough to hold. She stared at me. I let it sit. I spent $88,000 on that house, I told her. Not because you asked me to, but because I watched Grant get smaller every single time he sat across from your father and came up short in his own head. And I decided that as long as I had money, my daughter's husband was never going to have to go to that man with his hand out. That was the deal I made with myself. Not with you. With myself. Her jaw worked. Dad, but if I'm not enough family to earn a seat at the table, I said, then I'm not responsible anymore for financing the life you're building at that table. That's not spite, sweetheart. That's just math. She left 20 minutes later, car still warm in the driveway. I watched her taillights disappear down my gravel road and felt something I hadn't felt in 19 years. Like a man. Standing up straight. Now here's where the story turns, and I want you paying attention, because this is where the whole picture starts cracking open. Melissa went home and told Grant everything, and Grant did exactly what I expected. He called his mother. Grant told me later, almost word for word, how it went. Carol pacing her kitchen in Bexley, phone against her ear. Mom, Walter froze the renovation money. All of it. We need Dad to cover the last payment, or the whole thing stalls out completely. Carol's answer, delivered in that practiced, unbothered tone she used whenever she wanted a problem to sound smaller than it was. Don't you worry, honey. I'll talk to your father. 5 words that have bankrupted more families than any recession in history. Don't you worry, honey. Roland called Grant the next morning himself, and I wish I'd been able to see his face when he made that call, because Roland Pierce was a man who lived for exactly this kind of moment, the chance to swoop in and demonstrate, once again, his superiority over the engineer and the engineer's son-in-law. Grant, don't stress about this. I'll make some calls. This is nothing. Big voice. Total confidence. The cavalry riding in. Grant actually believed him. That relief lasted about 2 days. Roland promised the money by Monday morning. Monday came and went with a text about a temporary transfer delay. By Tuesday, his phone was going straight to voicemail. Wednesday morning, unable to look at his half-finished mudroom one more day, Grant drove to Bexley to sit across from his father-in-law and ask him directly, "Do you have the money or not?" And Roland Pierce, the man who'd spent 19 years making my son-in-law feel small across that glass table, looked back at him and said, "It's complicated right now, Grant. Complicated." Grant started pulling threads after that. And in a town the size of the one Roland lived in, once you pull one loose string, the whole coat comes apart in your hands. Because I'd sent formal notice about my equity interest in the Laurel Ridge property, Grant had to understand his own legal footing, and that sent him digging through the county property records looking for anything that might help. What he found shook him down to the floor. The house in Bexley, the crown jewel, had been refinanced 3 times in 5 years. There was almost no equity left in it. The bank owned that house in every way that mattered. Once his eyes were open, the small things started painting a much bigger picture. He remembered a call from a collections office about 6 weeks back that he'd dismissed as a wrong number. Now he wasn't so sure. He called a friend who worked at Roland's country club, and after a long pause, the friend admitted it. Roland's membership had been quietly suspended for non-payment 5 months earlier. The Cadillac Escalade in that driveway was leased through a business account that was currently in arrears and facing repossession. Roland Pierce wasn't wealthy. Roland Pierce was a performance, and the curtain had just come down in the middle of the show. Grant called me that night, almost 11 o'clock. "Walter." His voice was different, hollow, like a man who'd just walked through a door he couldn't walk back through. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Say what?" "That they were, that he was, all of it. Why didn't you tell me?" I was quiet a moment. "Because it wasn't mine to tell," I said. "A man doesn't tear down his son-in-law's marriage just to be proven right, even when he's right." He didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end. 19 years, Walter. I know. He made me feel like every dinner, every holiday, every time I tried to, he stopped, started again, and the whole time he was. "Yeah," I said softly. "The whole time." Long pause. "What do I do now?" And that question, right there, was the most grown I'd ever heard my son-in-law sound in 19 years of knowing him. "Nothing tonight," I told him. "Get some sleep. We'll sort the rest out together." Meanwhile, I'd had my own conversation with Frank Delacroix. Frank doesn't waste words. "Walter," he said, looking over the paperwork, "when you funded that renovation, you didn't just wire money. You secured part of the financing with your own name on a lien against the property. That means you carry exposure if things go sideways, but it also means you have standing. If this deteriorates, you could petition for a partition action to protect your equity." I sat with that for a minute. I didn't want the house sold. That was never the goal. Casey lived there. But I also wasn't going to stay legally tied to a piece of property where I'd just been told my presence was inconvenient. "Draft it," I said. "Don't file it. Just send a preliminary notice to Grant and Melissa so they understand I'm serious about protecting my equity." "Understood," Frank said. "Walter, are you sure about all this?" "I've been sure about very few things in my life," I told him. "This is one of them." When Melissa got that preliminary notice, when she understood that her father, the quiet engineer out on the ridge, had legal standing to force a sale, the panic that followed was, I'm told, biblical. Melissa called Grant at work in tears. Grant called Frank's office and was politely informed that Mr. Delacroix represented Walter Higbee and couldn't discuss the matter with him. Melissa called Carol, who called Roland, who apparently put his fist through the drywall in that dining room, right underneath a framed photo of himself shaking hands with some state senator. I heard that part secondhand. I won't pretend I didn't smile a little. Neighbors on Laurel Ridge had already started noticing. An abandoned renovation isn't subtle. Exposed subfloor, visible through the front windows, A pallet of unused tile, sitting under a tarp for 2 weeks. Contractors who'd been there daily just gone. People notice, people talk, even in a town spread out enough that you'd think they wouldn't. The image Roland had spent 19 years constructing, the successful patriarch, the man who had it handled, was coming apart in public, one unanswered question at a time. That's when Casey showed up at my door. Not Melissa, not Grant. Casey, 17 years old, drove herself over in the little Corolla I'd taught her to parallel park in the church parking lot 2 winters back. Stood on my porch on a Wednesday afternoon in her Asheville High soccer hoodie, my late wife's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Grandpa. She looked at me steady. I talked to Mr. Osei, one of the contractors. He told me you paid almost the whole renovation yourself. I stepped aside. Come in, Casey. She came in without needing a second invitation. I set a ginger ale in front of her, sat across from her at Doreen's table, and pulled a folder out of the kitchen drawer I'd kept since the day I froze that payment. Receipts, wire confirmations, material invoices, contractor agreements, every dollar of $88,000 itemized down to the nail. Casey went through it page by page, slow and careful, the way I'd taught her to read a blueprint the summer she was 12. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but she wouldn't let them spill. They told me you bailed on us, she said. I know, I said. That's not what this says. No, I agreed. It's not. She was quiet a long moment. So why'd you stop? She finally asked. I looked at my granddaughter, this girl I'd taught to cast a line off the dock at Lake Julian, and I told her the truth. Because there's a difference, I said, between loving your family and letting your family treat you like you're invisible. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her ginger ale, leaned back, and said, quiet, matter of fact, I never thought you were invisible, Grandpa. And just like that, 68 years old, a widower who'd built half the porches in this county, I had to work hard to keep my own eyes dry. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you've got a Roland Pierce somewhere in your own family tree, go ahead and drop that in the comments below and tell me who taught you the difference between a point and a line. I read every one of them. The house wasn't sold. The renovation didn't restart right away. And the $11,000 didn't end up where anybody expected. But the most lasting thing I did in all of this wasn't legal, and it wasn't financial. It was something quieter than both of those, and it stuck a lot longer. There's a moment in a man's life when he stops reacting to what's been done to him and starts deciding what he's going to do next. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of something colder and more useful than either of those. Clarity. I hit that moment on a Thursday morning in late June, sitting at Doreen's table with cold coffee and a legal pad covered in numbers. 88,000, 19 years. One text message. I picked up my pen and started writing. Frank showed up at 9 sharp that Thursday, drove his same dependable gray Ford like he'd driven for a decade, carried a leather case that had seen more family wreckage than most therapists' offices. He spread his papers out, looked at me over his glasses. Before we start, Walter, I want to be sure you've thought this all the way through. What you're describing is permanent. Frank, I said, I've been thinking this through for 19 years. I'm only just now writing it down. He almost smiled. Almost. All right then, he said. Let's get to work. Here's something most people get wrong about quiet men. They assume quiet means passive. They assume that because a man doesn't raise his voice, he isn't paying attention. They assume that because he smiles and passes the rolls and absorbs every insult without flinching, he's got no moves left to make. Roland Pierce made that assumption for 19 years. It turned out to be the most expensive mistake of his life. While Grant and Melissa were scrambling to find $11,000 for a mudroom, while Roland was making promises that went nowhere, while Melissa was calling Carol twice a day about the tile sitting under a tarp and the neighbors who kept slowing their cars down in front of the house, I was sitting with Frank Delacroix restructuring every financial decision I'd ever made for my daughter's family. First order of business. Getting my name off that property entirely. Frank sent the preliminary partition notice, and it did exactly what it was built to do. Melissa and Grant, with no help coming from the Pierce side of the family, had no choice but to go to a local lender and refinance the whole house into just their names to buy out my legal interest, It cost them. They ate a rough interest rate in that market, which pushed their monthly payment up hard. But it cut my legal exposure clean, and I walked out of that bank on a Friday afternoon, breathed in the mountain air, and felt a weight come off my shoulders I hadn't realized I'd been carrying that long. Second order of business, and this is the one that mattered. The 88,000 I'd already put into that house, gone, spent, done. That was a gift I gave freely, and I had no interest in clawing a dollar of it back from my own daughter. But the 11,000 still sitting frozen in my account, the final payment that never released, that money had a new destination in mind. Casey Delaney turned 18 that September. 3 weeks before her birthday, she got a certified letter delivered to the house on Laurel Ridge, addressed specifically to her. Not to Grant, not to Melissa, to Casey. Inside was paperwork from Frank's office finalizing a legally protected college fund in her name alone. $11,000, the exact figure Roland had once bragged loudly at a family dinner that he'd be covering for her freshman dorm deposit and books before his own accounts started freezing up around him. I hadn't just saved the renovation money. I'd taken the exact hole Roland left behind and filled it myself, quietly, with my own granddaughter's name on it. Alongside the paperwork was a handwritten note, 1 page, blue ink. My handwriting that Casey always said looked like blueprints. It read, "Casey, a house can always be rebuilt. Character can't. I hope this helps you build both." Every dollar in this account was earned honest and saved careful, and it's yours completely. No conditions, no strings, no other name on it. Go be exactly who your grandmother and I always knew you'd become. All my love, Grandpa Walter. Grant called me 20 minutes after Casey showed him that letter. Walter. His voice cracked on the first word, and I could hear 19 years of things neither one of us had ever said sitting right behind it. You didn't have to do that. I know, I said. That was supposed to be the I know what it was for, Grant. Silence. Why? He asked. Simple. No performance in it at all. Because your daughter deserves to start her life without owing a thing to anybody, I said. That's a feeling I wish I'd found a way to give you sooner. Didn't manage it in time for you. I'm giving it to her now. He didn't answer right away. I heard him exhale long and slow, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. I'm sorry, Walter, he said finally, for the way this whole thing happened, for letting it go on as long as I did. I let those words sit in the air a while before I answered. Come out Sunday, I said. I'll smoke a brisket. We'll sit on the porch like we used to before all this. Yeah, he said, quiet. I'd like that. Now, I know what you're waiting to hear. You want to know what happened to Roland Pierce. So did I. Pull up a chair. The listing notice Frank had prepared did its work before I ever had to actually file a single piece of it publicly. Word travels in a small mountain town faster than you'd think, and it travels farther. A father-in-law with legal standing to force a property sale isn't a rumor, it's a fire alarm. Roland's name was tied to that family, and by extension the story of the abandoned mudroom, the frozen payment, and the scramble to cover it became quiet knowledge around town inside of 2 weeks. The kind of thing that gets discussed at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, at the coffee counter downtown, at the tables outside the diner on Tunnel Road. People started asking Roland questions he had no good answers for. But the real unraveling didn't happen in Asheville. It happened at Roland's own dinner table. Grant brought the public foreclosure filings and the country club suspension letter home one evening, laid them out flat on the kitchen counter without raising his voice. Melissa sat across from him and read every page in complete silence. She looked at the debt totals, the late notices, the whole architecture of a lie her father had been maintaining just to keep up appearances. She didn't cry right away. She just went very still, all the color draining out of her face. He told me we came from money, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, hollow and cracked open. He told me that my entire life. Grant reached across and covered her hand with his. I know, he said softly. He looked down on your dad, she said. Her voice caught on that last word. He looked down on Walter. For what? For being honest about what he actually had. Grant didn't answer. He didn't need to. Melissa called me herself 3 days later. I'll be honest. I hadn't expected that call. Not that soon. For 19 years, my daughter and I had kept a cold, careful distance whenever her father was involved because she'd inherited a piece of his instinct to treat people like staff when it was convenient. But watching Roland's whole illusion collapse had clearly cracked something open in her, forced her to finally see who'd actually been protecting her family the whole time. This call was different. No armor in it at all. Dad. Her voice was steady, but I could hear what it cost her to keep it that way. I owe you an apology, a real one, not the polite kind. Melissa, please let me finish, Dad. She took a breath. I pushed Grant to go to my parents when you froze the payment. I thought they could fix it, because I'd spent my whole life believing they could fix anything. Another breath. I didn't know about the debt, about any of it, but that's not really an excuse, because I knew what my father did to you and Grant at those tables all those years, and I let it happen. I let it go on for a long time, and I'm sorry. I was quiet for a moment. Doreen used to say the strongest thing a person can do is apologize without leaving themselves an exit. I appreciate that, sweetheart, I said. I mean it, and for what it's worth, I never once blamed you. You should have, she said softly. Maybe, I told her. But I didn't. Roland Pierce called me exactly one time in 19 years. One time did that man dial my number directly and speak to me with no audience watching. It was a Monday evening in late June. I was out in my workshop. The cedar chest I'd been sanding the night that first text came in was finished, stained, and sitting by the door, waiting to be delivered. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. Columbus. I picked up. Walter. Roland's voice sounded different on the phone, without a dining table between us, and nobody around to perform for. Smaller, like a building that looks impressive from the street and hollow the second you step inside it. I think we ought to talk, man to man. Man to man. 19 years in, and suddenly we're men. We're talking right now, Roland, I said. Silence on his end. He hadn't expected it to be that easy. Look, he said, things got complicated with money. I want you to know none of that with Grant, and the house was intentional. Roland, I said, setting down the sandpaper, I'm going to stop you right there. He stopped. I don't need an explanation, I told him. I'm not angry with you. I want that clear. I'm not angry. I'm just finished. Finished pretending I don't see what I see. Finished funding a story where you're the patriarch and I'm the help. Finished co-signing a life where I'm welcome exactly when it's financially useful and shown the door the second it's socially inconvenient. I paused. I'm retired, Roland. From engineering. From all of it. Both. Long silence on the line. When he spoke again, the big voice was gone completely. What replaced it was something I'd never once heard out of Roland Pierce. A small, quiet man. I suppose I owe you more than I've ever paid you, he said slowly. You don't owe me a thing, I told him, and I meant every word. Just leave my daughter's family alone. Let Grant stand up straight for once in his life. That's all I ever wanted out of any of this. He hung up. I set the phone down, picked the sandpaper back up, finished the chest. Casey's 18th birthday celebration happened on a warm Saturday afternoon in late September, right there in my backyard. First real family gathering we'd had since the whole thing settled. No caterer, no country club lawn, no place cards, and certainly no Roland Pierce holding court at the head of any table. Just my backyard, string lights running through the maple tree, a cooler of sweet tea, pulled pork sandwiches, and a 3-layer chocolate cake from the same bakery on Merrimon that Doreen and I had ordered Casey's birthday cakes from since she was 5 years old. Grant showed up early to help me set up the folding tables. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There's a particular kind of quiet between a father-in-law and a son-in-law once it's been repaired. Not perfect, still some scar tissue underneath it, but repaired. And it feels entirely different from the quiet of two men avoiding each other. It feels like relief. Melissa brought flowers from her own garden and arranged them in mason jars down the tables without anybody asking her to. She caught my eye once, gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Casey arrived with 2 friends from the soccer team, loud in the particular way 18-year-olds are supposed to be loud. And when she came through the back gate and saw the whole setup, the lights, the tables, Her parents, standing together without performing for anybody. Her grandfather over by the grill in an old flannel shirt with tongs in his hand, and not one apology to offer for any of it. She stopped for a second, then walked straight over and hugged me the way you hug somebody you were genuinely afraid of losing. "Thanks for not giving up on us, Grandpa," she said into my shoulder. 68 years old, and I held on a little longer than I probably should have. "Wasn't ever an option," I told her. "Now go eat. You're making me look sentimental in front of company." She laughed, big and real and unguarded, and went to find her friends. While we celebrated in that backyard, Roland and Carol were sitting in an empty house in Bexley staring down a foreclosure notice. The Escalade had already gone back to the dealership on a quiet weekday morning with nobody around to see it happen. I never had to lift a finger to bring Roland Pierce's whole life down. 19 years of borrowed money and careful lies did that work all on its own. I just stopped holding up the mirror that let him see himself the way he wanted to. There's something nobody tells you about this kind of reckoning, the real kind, the kind that actually holds. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like a warm September evening in your own backyard. String lights in a maple tree. Your granddaughter laughing with her friends across the yard. Your son-in-law sitting in a lawn chair with a sweet tea, more at ease than you've seen him look in almost 2 decades. It feels like finally understanding the difference between what you build and what you only ever fund. Roland Pierce funded an illusion for 19 years. I built a family, and on that Saturday evening, watching Casey blow out 18 candles while her friends cheered around her, Grant walked over to where I was standing by the grill. "I went back and read that text from June," he said, his voice thick. "I don't recognize the man who let that happen. I'm sorry, Walter, for all of it." He reached out and, for the first time in 19 years, my son-in-law hugged me like he finally understood exactly who'd been standing behind him the whole time. Watching those candles go out, listening to the string lights hum faintly in the breeze, I finally understood something Doreen used to try and tell me for years before she passed. The greatest inheritance a man leaves behind isn't money. It isn't a house. It isn't even his name. It's the truth of who he was when nobody was watching and it would have cost him nothing to look away instead. I'm Walter Higbee, 68 years old, retired, and I built something Roland Pierce never once managed to, something that actually lasts. If this one meant something to you, hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and I will see you on the next porch.